Snobbish billionaire dumps fiancée for a maid, her secret shocks the world. The chandeliers in the grand hall of the Blake estate shimmered like 1,000 tiny stars, casting a golden glow over the room. Waitstaff moved in perfect synchrony, preparing the space for the evening's engagement party. Jonathan Blake stood at the top of the marble staircase, surveying the scene with a sense of detached satisfaction. Everything looked perfect, just as he'd demanded. After all, perfection was what he paid for. Jonathan adjusted the cuffs of his tailored tuxedo, his sharp features betraying nothing of the restlessness simmering beneath the surface. Tonight, he would officially announce his engagement to Victoria Kensington, a woman who, by all outward appearances, was his perfect match. She was stunning, poised, and came from a family with a pedigree that matched his own. Their union was the talk of high society, a merger of two dynasties that promised to solidify their dominance in both business and social circles. And yet, as he gazed at the ornate decorations and the impeccably dressed staff bustling about, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. "Mr. Blake?" A soft, hesitant voice broke through his thoughts. Jonathan turned to see Sophia, one of the maids, standing a few steps below him on the staircase. She was carrying a silver tray with folded linens, her uniform crisp and immaculate. There was a quiet grace about her, a calm presence that contrasted sharply with the whirlwind of activity around them. "Yes?" Jonathan said, his tone curt but not unkind. Sophia hesitated, her brown eyes meeting his for a fleeting moment before looking away. "I just wanted to let you know that the guest rooms have been prepared, and the head chef asked me to confirm the final menu with you." Jonathan nodded, barely registering her words. "Fine. Let him know it's approved." Sophia gave a small nod and turned to leave, but Jonathan stopped her. "Wait." She paused, looking back at him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Do you think it's too much?" he asked suddenly, gesturing to the lavish decorations and the opulence that filled the room. Sophia blinked, clearly taken aback by the question. "I'm not sure what you mean, sir." "This," Jonathan said, descending a few steps and motioning to the crystal chandeliers, the gold-trimmed drapes, the extravagant floral arrangements. "Does it seem excessive?" Sophia hesitated, her gaze flickering over the scene before returning to his. "It's beautiful," she said carefully. "But I suppose beauty doesn't always mean it feels right." Jonathan stared at her, surprised by the depth of her response. He hadn't expected a maid to say something so insightful or so honest. "Noted," he said, his voice softening. "Thank you." Sophia gave a small curtsy and continued on her way, leaving Jonathan alone with his thoughts. The party began promptly at 8 p.m., with the estate's grand doors opening to welcome a parade of glittering guests. The air buzzed with excitement as men in sharp tuxedos and women in flowing gowns filled the hall, their laughter and chatter echoing off the marble walls. Jonathan played his role perfectly, greeting guests with practiced charm and exchanging pleasantries that meant little to him. Victoria arrived fashionably late as always, making an entrance that drew every eye in the room. She was radiant in a silver gown that hugged her slender figure, her blonde hair styled in perfect waves. "Darling," she cooed as she reached Jonathan, kissing him lightly on the cheek. "You've outdone yourself. The estate looks stunning." "Only the best for you," Jonathan replied, though his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. As the evening progressed, Jonathan found himself increasingly distracted. While Victoria flitted from one socialite to another, charming them with her wit and beauty, Jonathan retreated to the edges of the room, nursing a glass of champagne and observing the scene. He couldn't help but notice how her interactions seemed calculated, as though every word and gesture were designed to impress rather than connect. His thoughts were interrupted when he overheard a conversation near the balcony. Stepping closer, he recognized Victoria's voice, sharp and dismissive. "Do you really think I care about him?" she said, laughing. "Jonathan is a means to an end. Once the wedding's over, I'll have everything I need. His name, his money, his connections. The rest doesn't matter." Jonathan froze, his grip tightening on his champagne glass. The words cut deeper than he expected, confirming the nagging doubts he'd been trying to ignore. One of her friends giggled. "You're terrible, Victoria. But I suppose that's what it takes to win in this world." Victoria smirked, her voice dripping with confidence. It's not about winning. It's about survival. And trust me, I always come out on top. Jonathan turned away, his heart pounding. For the first time, he felt the weight of the decisions he had made, decisions driven by appearances and expectations rather than substance or sincerity. He thought of Sophia's words earlier, beauty doesn't always mean it feels right. Later that night, as the party wound down, Jonathan found himself wandering through the quieter parts of the estate. He passed by the staff quarters and saw a faint light coming from the kitchen. Peeking inside, he found Sophia sitting at the table, folding linens with meticulous care. "Working late?" he asked, stepping into the room. Sophia looked up, startled. "Mr. Blake, I didn't expect to see you here." Jonathan leaned against the doorway, his expression unreadable. "It's been a long night. I needed some air." Sophia nodded, returning to her task. "I can imagine. It must be exhausting hosting so many people." "It is," Jonathan admitted. "But that's not what's bothering me." Sophia glanced at him, her curiosity evident. "What is?" Jonathan hesitated, unsure why he felt compelled to confide in her. "Have you ever made a decision because it seemed like the right thing to do, only to realize it was all wrong?" Sophia's hands stilled, her gaze thoughtful. "I think everyone has at some point, but it's what you do after that realization that matters." Her words struck a chord, and for the first time that evening, Jonathan felt a glimmer of clarity. "You're right," he said softly. "Thank you." Sophia smiled faintly, her eyes warm. "Anytime." As Jonathan left the kitchen, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, that his perfect world was about to be turned upside down. The days following the engagement party were tense. Jonathan couldn't stop replaying Victoria's cruel words in his mind. Her laughter, her arrogance. It was as though she had stripped away the carefully constructed facade he had built around their relationship, exposing it for what it truly was, hollow. Jonathan buried himself in work, using the demands of his family's vast business empire as a distraction. Meetings, reports, calls, anything to keep his mind off Victoria. But no matter how busy he tried to make himself, her words lingered like an unwelcome shadow. It was during one of these restless afternoons that he found himself wandering into the estate gardens. The sprawling grounds were usually his refuge, a place to clear his head, but today they offered little solace. As he strolled past the fountain, he noticed someone kneeling by the flower beds, carefully trimming a bush of hydrangeas. It was Sophia. She wore her usual uniform, her hair tucked neatly under her maid's cap, and her movements were precise and deliberate. She didn't notice him at first, her focus entirely on her work. There was something calming about the sight, her quiet competence, the way she treated even the smallest task with care. "Do you ever stop working?" Jonathan asked, his voice breaking the stillness. Sophia looked up, startled, before offering a small smile. "Not if I can help it, sir. There's always something that needs doing." Jonathan smirked, leaning against the stone railing of the garden path. "You know, you're the only person around here who doesn't seem to be trying to impress me." Sophia tilted her head, considering his words. "That's because I'm not," she said simply. "I'm here to do my job, not to pretend to be something I'm not." Her honesty caught him off guard. In his world, where every interaction was layered with ulterior motives, her directness felt almost foreign. "Maybe that's why I find talking to you refreshing," he admitted. Sophia arched an eyebrow, amused. "Is that so?" Jonathan nodded, his expression serious. "It is. Most people tell me what they think I want to hear. You tell me the truth." Sophia returned her attention to the flowers, her tone thoughtful. "The truth can be a heavy thing to carry. Not everyone wants it." "That's true," Jonathan said quietly, thinking of Victoria. For a moment, they lapsed into silence, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, Jonathan asked, "Why did you choose this job?" Sophia paused, her pruning shears hovering over a stem. "What do you mean? You're clearly intelligent. You could be doing something else, something more." Jonathan gestured vaguely, as though searching for the right words. Sophia smiled faintly, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. Sometimes life doesn't give you the luxury of choosing your path. You just have to make the best of where you are. Jonathan frowned, sensing there was more to her story than she was letting on. But before he could press further, a voice called out from the distance. "Jonathan!" He turned to see Victoria striding toward him, her heels clicking against the cobblestones. She was dressed impeccably as always, her expression a mixture of irritation and entitlement. "I've been looking for you everywhere," she said, ignoring Sophia entirely. "We need to finalize the guest list for the wedding." Jonathan straightened, his jaw tightening. "Do we? I thought you had everything under control." Victoria sighed dramatically, placing a hand on his arm. "I do, but it's important for us to present a united front. People are expecting perfection." Jonathan glanced at Sophia, who had returned to her work, seemingly oblivious to their conversation. "Excuse me," he said to Victoria, his tone cool. "I'll be with you shortly." Victoria's eyes narrowed, but she didn't argue. "Fine. Don't keep me waiting." As she walked away, Jonathan turned back to Sophia. "Sorry about that." Sophia shook her head, her expression unreadable. "No need to apologize." But Jonathan felt the need to say more. "I'm not sure why I'm telling you this, but I'm starting to think perfection isn't all it's cracked up to be." Sophia glanced at him, her gaze steady. "Perfection isn't real, Mr. Blake. It's just a mask people wear to hide what they don't want others to see." Her words struck a chord, and for the first time in days, Jonathan felt a glimmer of clarity. He nodded, his voice quiet. Maybe it's time to take off the mask. That evening, as Jonathan sat in his study, Victoria burst in unannounced, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. "Jonathan, we need to talk," she said, her voice clipped. He leaned back in his chair, steeling himself for whatever she had to say. "Go on." Victoria crossed her arms, her expression icy. "People are talking. They're saying you've been distant, distracted. That you're not taking this engagement seriously." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "And by people, you mean you?" Victoria ignored the jab, her tone growing sharper. "This is about more than just us, Jonathan. Our families, our reputations, everything depends on this wedding. You can't afford to have cold feet." Jonathan's jaw tightened, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Cold feet? Is that what you think this is about? What else could it be?" Victoria snapped. "You're the one who insisted on this engagement, and now you're acting like it's some burden." Jonathan stood, his voice firm. "I insisted because it seemed like the right thing to do. But now I'm starting to wonder if I was wrong." Victoria stared at him, her shock quickly giving way to anger. "Wrong? How dare you?" "Stop," Jonathan said, his tone cutting through her tirade. "I've been ignoring my instincts for too long, trying to make this work. But the truth is, we're not right for each other." Victoria's face hardened, her voice trembling with rage. "You're calling this off? Just like that?" Jonathan nodded, his expression resolute. "Yes. It's better to end this now than to keep pretending." For a moment, Victoria said nothing, her chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. Then, with a venomous glare, she spat, "You'll regret this, Jonathan. I promise you." She stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Jonathan sank back into his chair, the weight of his decisions settling over him. He knew the fallout would be brutal: gossip, scandal, judgment. But for the first time in years, he felt a sense of freedom. The next morning, news of the broken engagement was splashed across every tabloid. Headlines screamed about the shocking split, speculating wildly about what had gone wrong. Jonathan ignored the chaos, focusing instead on what lay ahead. He found Sophia in the library, dusting the shelves with quiet efficiency. She glanced up as he entered, her expression a mix of surprise and curiosity. "You've probably seen the headlines," he said, leaning against the doorframe. Sophia nodded. "I'm sorry you're going through this." Jonathan smiled faintly. "Don't be. It was my choice." Sophia studied him for a moment before speaking. "And are you okay with that choice?" "Yes," he said firmly. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like I've done something right." Sophia's lips curved into a small smile. "Then I'm glad." Jonathan took a step closer, his gaze steady. You're different, Sophia. You see things clearly without all the noise and distractions. I think I need more of that in my life. Sophia tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. Clarity comes from knowing what matters. And from letting go of what doesn't. Jonathan nodded, her words resonating deeply. He wasn't sure where this new path would lead, but he knew one thing: Sophia was a part of it. The fallout from the broken engagement spread like wildfire. Within hours of the announcement, whispers of betrayal and scandal rippled through high society. Jonathan had expected the backlash, but even he was surprised by the intensity of the speculation. Tabloids painted him as a man in crisis, unable to commit, while Victoria was cast as the wronged socialite, her reputation bolstered by her dramatic public statements. Jonathan Blake doesn't know what he wants, Victoria told reporters outside a designer boutique, her voice perfectly calibrated for sympathy. I just hope he finds clarity before it's too late. Jonathan rolled his eyes when he saw the footage on the evening news. Clarity was exactly what he had found, and it had nothing to do with Victoria. For the first time in years, he felt like he was making decisions for himself rather than for the sake of appearances. But clarity came with its own set of challenges, and he was beginning to realize just how much his world was about to change. Sophia, meanwhile, tried to stay out of the spotlight. The rumors swirling around the estate were impossible to ignore, and she could feel the weight of judgment from some of the staff. Many speculated about the real reason for the broken engagement, their whispers growing louder whenever she entered a room. Do you think he left her for someone else? One maid murmured in the kitchen as Sophia walked past. Maybe, another replied. But who would be crazy enough to go after a billionaire? That's asking for trouble. Sophia clenched her jaw and kept walking, determined not to let the gossip affect her. She had no intention of getting involved in Jonathan's personal life, at least, not any more than she already had. But staying unnoticed was becoming increasingly difficult, especially as Jonathan began seeking her out more often. One afternoon, Sophia was tidying the study when Jonathan walked in, his expression thoughtful. "Sophia," he said, his voice pulling her from her work. "Do you have a moment?" She straightened, brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "Of course, sir. What can I do for you?" Jonathan hesitated, as though weighing his words carefully. "I wanted to thank you. For listening. For being honest with me when no one else was." Sophia tilted her head, surprised by his sincerity. "I was just doing my job." "No," Jonathan said, stepping closer. "You've done more than that. You've made me think about things differently. About what matters." Sophia's heart quickened at the intensity in his gaze, but she forced herself to stay composed. "I'm glad if I could help." Jonathan smiled faintly, his eyes lingering on her for a moment before he spoke again. "Have you ever thought about doing something else? About leaving this place and pursuing more?" Sophia's breath caught, her mind flashing back to the life she had left behind. "More isn't always an option for people like me," she said quietly. "Sometimes, you just have to make the best of where you are." Jonathan frowned, sensing the sadness beneath her words. "But you're capable of so much more." "I can see that." Sophia met his gaze, her voice steady. "Sometimes, capability isn't enough. There are things in my past, things I can't change." "What kind of things?" Jonathan asked, his curiosity piqued. Sophia hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the desk. For a moment, she considered telling him the truth about who she really was and why she had taken this job. But the thought of exposing her secrets, of shattering the fragile trust between them, was too much to bear. "Things that don't matter anymore," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan studied her, his expression unreadable. He could tell she was holding something back, but he didn't press further. "Well, if you ever feel like talking, I'm here." Sophia nodded, her chest tightening with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "Thank you, sir." Jonathan smiled, the warmth in his eyes disarming. "You can call me Jonathan, you know." Sophia blinked, taken aback. "I don't think that's appropriate." "It is if I say it is," Jonathan replied, his tone light. "We're not that different, you and I." Sophia bit her lip, unsure how to respond. She wanted to believe him, but the gulf between their worlds felt insurmountable. While Jonathan was drawn to Sophia's quiet strength, Victoria was consumed by fury. Being dumped was humiliating enough, but to be replaced by a maid, if the rumors were true, was unbearable. She couldn't stand the thought of Jonathan choosing someone so beneath him, someone who didn't belong in their world. Determined to reclaim her place, Victoria began digging into Sophia's past. She hired a private investigator, instructing him to uncover every detail of the maid's life, no matter how small. "She's hiding something," Victoria insisted during one of their meetings. "I can feel it. And when we find out what it is, Jonathan will come crawling back to me." The investigator nodded, his expression neutral. "I'll see what I can find." Victoria smirked, her confidence returning. She had always been a survivor, and she wasn't about to let some nobody steal what was rightfully hers. A week later, Victoria received a call from the investigator. His voice was laced with urgency as he said, "You're going to want to see this." They met in a dimly lit office downtown, where the investigator laid out a file filled with photos and documents. Victoria's eyes scanned the pages, her expression shifting from curiosity to shock. "This can't be real," she murmured, her fingers trembling as she held up a photograph of Sophia as a child, standing beside a man Victoria recognized from old society pages. "It's real," the investigator confirmed. "Sophia isn't just a maid. She's Sophia Montrose, the daughter of Charles Montrose." Victoria's jaw dropped. Charles Montrose had been one of the most influential businessmen in the country before his empire had crumbled under the weight of scandal. His fall from grace had been swift and brutal, leaving his family in ruins. Victoria leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Oh, this is better than I could have hoped for." "What do you want me to do with this information?" the investigator asked. Victoria tapped her manicured nails against the desk, her mind racing. "We're going to use it, but not yet. I want to see how this plays out first." Unaware of Victoria's discovery, Jonathan continued to spend more time with Sophia. Their conversations grew deeper, more personal as Jonathan opened up about his fears, his regrets, and his dreams. Sophia listened with quiet empathy, offering insights that surprised him with their depth. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace in the library, Jonathan said, "I've never felt this way before." Sophia glanced at him, her brow furrowing. "What way?" "Like I'm finally seeing things clearly," he said, his gaze steady. "Like I know what I want, and it's not what I thought it would be." Sophia's heart ached at his words, torn between the connection she felt with him and the secret she carried. She knew that if he ever learned the truth, everything would change. "Jonathan," she said softly, "there's something I need to tell you." But before she could continue, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. A moment later, the butler appeared in the doorway, his expression grave. "Sir," he said, "there's someone here to see you." "Miss Kensington?" Jonathan's jaw tightened, his mood shifting instantly. "Tell her I'm not available." "She insisted," the butler said. "She says it's urgent?" Jonathan sighed, standing reluctantly. "I'll handle it." He turned to Sophia, his expression apologetic. "We'll talk later." Sophia nodded, her chest tight with anticipation. As Jonathan left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was only just beginning. Jonathan found Victoria in the sitting room, standing by the fireplace with an air of practiced elegance. She was dressed impeccably, her silver jewelry glinting in the firelight. But there was a sharpness in her eyes that immediately put him on edge. "Victoria," he said, his tone clipped. "What do you want?" She turned to him with a saccharine smile. "Is that any way to greet me, Jonathan? I thought we could have a civilized conversation." "I don't have time for games," Jonathan replied, crossing his arms. "If this is about the engagement, we've already been through this." Victoria's smile faltered, replaced by a glint of malice. "Oh, this isn't about the engagement," she said, her voice low. "This is about your little maid." Jonathan stiffened, his expression hardening. "Leave her out of this." "I would," Victoria said, feigning innocence. "But it seems she's more involved in your life than I realized. And I couldn't help but wonder, do you even know who she really is?" Jonathan frowned, his unease growing. "What are you talking about?" Victoria's smile widened as she stepped closer, holding up a folded piece of paper. "Sophia Montrose," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "Does that name mean anything to you?" Jonathan's stomach dropped. He snatched the paper from her hand, his eyes scanning the document. It was a copy of an old newspaper article detailing the downfall of Charles Montrose, once a prominent businessman and a rival of Jonathan's father. "She's his daughter," Victoria said, savoring his reaction. "The little maid you've been spending so much time with is from the family your father destroyed." Jonathan's grip on the paper tightened, his mind racing. He had heard of Charles Montrose before. His father had spoken of him as a cautionary tale, a man who had been too ambitious for his own good. But the idea that Sophia was connected to that story, that she had been hiding her true identity, was almost too much to process. "What are you planning to do with this?" he asked, his voice cold. Victoria's smile turned predatory. "That depends on you. If you want this to stay quiet, you'll reconsider your decision to end our engagement. Think about it, Jonathan. Do you really want this scandal tied to your family name?" Jonathan glared at her, his anger simmering. "You think you can blackmail me?" Victoria shrugged, her confidence unwavering. "Call it what you want. I'm just giving you an opportunity to protect your reputation and hers." Jonathan's jaw tightened as he stared at her, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He couldn't deny the implications of what Victoria had revealed, but he also couldn't stand the thought of letting her manipulate him. "Get out," he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. Victoria's eyes narrowed. "You'll regret this, Jonathan." "Not as much as you will," he replied, stepping closer. "Now get out of my house." Victoria hesitated for a moment before turning on her heel and storming out. Jonathan watched her go, his chest heaving with frustration. When the door slammed shut behind her, he sank into a nearby chair, his head in his hands. Sophia was in the kitchen, preparing tea, when Jonathan appeared in the doorway. His usually composed demeanor was gone, replaced by a tension she had never seen before. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her brow furrowing. Jonathan didn't answer right away. Instead, he crossed the room and placed the newspaper article on the counter in front of her. "Care to explain this?" he asked, his voice tight. Sophia's eyes widened as she saw the article. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, her heart sinking. She had known this day might come, but she hadn't expected it to happen like this. "I was going to tell you," she said softly, unable to meet his gaze. "But I didn't know how." Jonathan's voice was sharper now. "So it's true? You're Charles Montrose's daughter?" "Yes," Sophia admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not what you think." "Then explain," Jonathan said, his frustration evident. "Why are you here? What are you trying to do?" Sophia took a deep breath, her mind racing. "When my father's business collapsed, we lost everything. He didn't survive it. After he passed, my mother and I struggled to get by. I took this job because I needed to support her, but also because I wanted to understand the family that destroyed mine." Jonathan stared at her, his emotions warring within him. "So this was about revenge?" "At first," Sophia admitted, her voice trembling. "But then I got to know you, and I saw that you weren't the person I thought you'd be. You're not your father, Jonathan." Her words cut through his anger, leaving him with a hollow ache. He had spent his whole life trying to escape his father's shadow, and now he was being confronted with the consequences of that legacy in the most personal way. "Why didn't you just tell me?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Because I was afraid," Sophia said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Afraid you'd hate me. Afraid you'd think I was just like Victoria, trying to use you." Jonathan shook his head, his frustration giving way to something deeper. "Sophia, you should have trusted me." "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "And I'm sorry." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their unspoken emotions filling the room. Then Jonathan reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice steady. "But you need to promise me one thing, no more secrets?" Sophia nodded, her tears spilling over. "I promise." The next morning, Jonathan called an emergency meeting with his legal team. He wanted to understand every detail of his father's dealings with Charles Montrose, to uncover the truth of what had happened all those years ago. As he pored over old documents and records, a clearer picture began to emerge. It turned out that Charles Montrose's downfall wasn't as simple as his father had made it seem. While Charles had made some poor business decisions, Jonathan's father had taken advantage of the situation, using aggressive tactics to eliminate his competition. The revelation left Jonathan sick to his stomach. That evening, he found Sophia in the library, sitting by the window with a distant look in her eyes. "I found out the truth," he said, sitting across from her. "My father, he wasn't innocent in what happened to your family." Sophia looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I already knew that." Jonathan's chest tightened. "I'm sorry, Sophia. For everything." "It's not your fault," she said quietly. "You're not responsible for his choices." "But I am responsible for what I do now," Jonathan said firmly. "And I want to make things right." Sophia studied him, her gaze softening. "How?" "I don't know yet," Jonathan admitted. "But I'll figure it out. You deserve better than this." Sophia's lips curved into a faint smile. "You really mean that, don't you?" "Yes," Jonathan said, his voice steady. "I do." Meanwhile, Victoria was busy executing the next phase of her plan. She leaked the story of Sophia's identity to the tabloids, framing it as a scandal that would destroy Jonathan's reputation. Within hours, headlines blared about the Maid's secret and billionaire caught in a family feud. Jonathan's phone buzzed incessantly with calls from reporters and concerned associates, but he refused to be rattled. Instead, he called a press conference to address the rumors head-on. Standing before a sea of cameras, Jonathan spoke with unwavering confidence. "Yes, Sophia Montrose is the daughter of Charles Montrose," he said. "And yes, my father's actions contributed to her family's downfall. But Sophia is not defined by her past, and neither am I. She is one of the most intelligent, compassionate, and resilient people I have ever met, and I am proud to call her my friend." The room erupted with questions, but Jonathan held his ground, making it clear that he would not tolerate any attempts to vilify Sophia. When he returned to the estate that evening, he found Sophia waiting for him in the garden. Her eyes were red, but there was a warmth in her smile. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Yes, I did," Jonathan replied. "Because it's the truth. And I'm done hiding from it." Sophia stepped closer, her voice trembling. "Thank you." Jonathan reached for her hand, his gaze steady. "You don't have to thank me, Sophia. We're in this together." For the first time, Sophia felt the weight of her burdens lift. She didn't know what the future held, but standing there with Jonathan, she knew they would face it together. The days following Jonathan's press conference were a whirlwind. The media frenzy refused to die down, with journalists clamoring for more details about Sophia and her connection to the Montrose family. Questions about Jonathan's motives swirled. Was he protecting her out of guilt, or was there something more to their relationship? Jonathan paid little attention to the speculation. His focus was on two things: shielding Sophia from the worst of the fallout and finding a way to repair the damage caused by his father's actions. He had spent too long living in the shadow of his family's legacy, and now he had a chance to rewrite that narrative. Sophia, however, was struggling. The constant media attention had turned her life upside down. Paparazzi lurked outside the estate gates, hoping to catch a glimpse of her, and the staff's whispers had grown louder. She could feel their judgment, their curiosity, every time she walked into a room. One afternoon, she found herself retreating to the estate's library, seeking solace among the rows of books. She sat by the window, staring out at the gardens, her mind racing. She had spent years trying to keep her past buried, and now it had been dragged into the spotlight for the world to see. "Mind if I join you?" Sophia turned to see Jonathan standing in the doorway, his expression gentle. "Of course," she said, offering a small smile. Jonathan crossed the room and sat across from her, his gaze searching. "How are you holding up?" Sophia shrugged, her smile faltering. "I've been better. It's a lot to process." "I know," Jonathan said, his voice soft. "But you're not alone in this. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Sophia looked down at her hands, her chest tightening. "Why are you doing this, Jonathan? Why are you putting yourself through all this for me?" Jonathan leaned forward, his voice steady. Because you're worth it. Because I see you for who you are, not just where you came from. And because I care about you. Sophia's breath caught, her heart pounding at his words. She met his gaze, searching for any hint of insincerity, but all she saw was honesty. Jonathan, she began, her voice trembling. Before she could say more, the door to the library burst open, and Gregor, Jonathan's personal assistant, hurried in, his face pale. "Mr. Blake," Gregor said urgently. "You need to see this." Jonathan frowned, rising from his seat. "What is it?" Gregor handed him a tablet, the screen displaying a news article with the headline, "Rival Business Tycoon Teams Up with Victoria Kensington to Take Down Jonathan Blake." Jonathan's jaw tightened as he skimmed the article. The rival in question was none other than Malcolm Hayes, a ruthless businessman who had clashed with the Blake family for years. The article detailed how Victoria and Hayes were working together to discredit Jonathan, spreading rumors about his leadership and questioning his ability to run his family's empire. "Of course she'd stoop this low," Jonathan muttered, his frustration mounting. Sophia stood, her brow furrowing. "What does this mean for you?" "It means they're trying to destroy everything I've built," Jonathan said, his voice firm. "But I'm not going to let them." He turned to Gregor. "Schedule a meeting with the board. I want to get ahead of this." Gregor nodded and hurried out of the room, leaving Jonathan and Sophia alone once more. "This is my fault," Sophia said quietly, her voice tinged with guilt. "If I hadn't come here—" "Don't," Jonathan interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. "This isn't your fault, Sophia. This is about them, not you." Sophia hesitated, her emotions warring within her. "I just don't want to make things harder for you." "You're not," Jonathan said, stepping closer. "You've given me something I didn't even realize I was missing: perspective. Purpose. I don't regret any of this, and neither should you." Sophia felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that things might turn out okay. The board meeting the next day was tense. Jonathan stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding as he addressed the gathered executives. "As you've all seen, Malcolm Hayes and Victoria Kensington are attempting to undermine our reputation," Jonathan began. "But I want to make one thing clear: we will not be intimidated." One of the board members, a gray-haired man named Wallace, leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "Jonathan, this situation with Miss Montrose has caused a lot of concern among our investors. How do you plan to address it?" Jonathan met Wallace's gaze, his voice unwavering. "By being transparent. I've already spoken publicly about Sophia's connection to my family, and I've taken steps to review my father's business practices. Our focus should be on moving forward, not dwelling on the past." Another board member, a woman named Eleanor, nodded in agreement. "I think Jonathan's approach is the right one. Showing accountability and a willingness to change will strengthen our position." The discussion continued, with Jonathan defending his decisions and outlining his plans to counter Hayes and Victoria's efforts. By the end of the meeting, he had secured the board's support, but he knew the battle was far from over. As the days passed, Jonathan and Sophia grew closer, their bond deepening with each shared conversation and quiet moment. But their connection wasn't without its challenges. The constant scrutiny from the media and the pressure from Jonathan's world weighed heavily on Sophia, who still struggled to reconcile her feelings for him with her lingering doubts. One evening, as they walked through the gardens, Jonathan stopped and turned to her, his expression serious. "Sophia," he said, taking her hands in his, "I know this hasn't been easy for you. And I know I've dragged you into a world you never wanted to be part of. But I need you to know how much you mean to me." Sophia's breath hitched, her heart pounding in her chest. "Jonathan, I've spent my whole life surrounded by people who only care about what I can give them," he continued. "But you're different. You see me for who I am, not what I have. I think I'm falling for you." Sophia's eyes filled with tears as she stared at him, her emotions overwhelming her. "But I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Jonathan said softly. "I just needed you to know how I feel." Sophia hesitated, her mind racing. She wanted to believe in the possibility of a future with him, but the weight of her past and the challenges they faced felt insurmountable. "I care about you too," she said finally, her voice trembling. But it's complicated. I don't care about complicated, Jonathan said, his grip on her hands tightening. I care about you. For a moment, they stood in silence, the only sound the rustling of the leaves in the evening breeze. Then, slowly, Sophia nodded, a small smile breaking through her tears. Okay, she said softly. Let's see where this goes. Jonathan's smile widened, and he pulled her into an embrace, the warmth of his arms wrapping around her like a shield against the chaos of the outside world. But the chaos was far from over. Victoria and Hayes weren't finished with their schemes, and the storm they were brewing threatened to destroy everything Jonathan and Sophia were building. As they faced the challenges ahead, Jonathan and Sophia knew one thing for certain: they would face them together. Victoria's partnership with Malcolm Hayes was proving to be more effective than she could have hoped. Within days of the press conference, new articles flooded the tabloids, painting Jonathan as reckless, incompetent, and unable to control his emotions. The story shifted focus from Sophia's connection to the Montrose family to Jonathan's leadership of his family's empire, questioning whether he was capable of holding the reins of such a powerful dynasty. For Jonathan, the pressure was relentless. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from board members, investors, and advisors, each more anxious than the last. Meetings stretched late into the night as he worked to reassure everyone that he had the situation under control. But despite his best efforts, the strain was beginning to show. Sophia watched him with growing concern. She had seen the confident, composed man he was at his core, but now he seemed worn down, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his responsibilities. Jonathan, she said one evening as they sat in the library, his laptop open in front of him. You can't keep doing this to yourself. You need to take a break. He glanced at her, his expression weary. I can't afford to take a break. Not with Hayes and Victoria coming at me from every angle. But you won't be any good to anyone if you burn out, Sophia said, her voice gentle but firm. You need to let people help you. Jonathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm not used to relying on others. My father always taught me to handle things myself. Sophia's gaze softened. Sometimes strength means knowing when to ask for help. You don't have to do this alone. Jonathan looked at her, the sincerity in her words striking a chord. He nodded slowly, his shoulders relaxing slightly. You're right. I don't want to let anyone down. You won't, Sophia said, reaching for his hand. You're doing everything you can. And that's enough. Meanwhile, Victoria and Hayes were preparing their next move. Hayes, a shrewd and calculating businessman, had been working behind the scenes to weaken Jonathan's position, quietly poaching key allies and spreading rumors among the company's board members. We need to hit him where it hurts, Hayes said during a private meeting with Victoria. If we can convince the board to lose confidence in him, it's game over. Victoria smirked, swirling her wine glass as she considered his words. And how do you plan to do that? Leverage, Hayes replied, his voice cold. Jonathan's father built his empire by stepping on others, and there are plenty of people who still remember that. If we can tie Jonathan to those old scandals, it'll tarnish his reputation beyond repair. Victoria's smile widened. Perfect. Let's remind the world that a Blake will always be a Blake. The next blow came in the form of a leaked document, an old contract signed by Jonathan's father that detailed an underhanded deal with a struggling competitor. The contract had been buried for years, but Hayes had unearthed it and fed it to the media, spinning it as evidence of Jonathan continuing his father's corrupt practices. The backlash was immediate. Headlines screamed about the legacy of deceit, and protesters gathered outside the Blake headquarters, demanding accountability. Jonathan found himself thrust into damage control mode, scrambling to address the allegations while trying to keep his company afloat. Sophia watched helplessly as the attacks piled up, feeling the weight of her own guilt. Though she knew Hayes and Victoria were the real villains, she couldn't shake the feeling that her presence in Jonathan's life had made things worse. Maybe I should leave, she said one evening, her voice trembling. If I wasn't here, they wouldn't have so much ammunition against you. Jonathan looked at her, his expression firm. Don't say that. This isn't your fault, Sophia. Hayes and Victoria would have found a way to come after me regardless. But I've made it easier for them, Sophia said, tears welling in her eyes. I've brought nothing but trouble to your life. Jonathan stepped closer, his hands gently cupping her face. You've brought more good into my life than I ever thought possible. Don't let them make you believe otherwise. Sophia searched his eyes, her heart aching at the intensity of his words. I just want to protect you. And I want to protect you, Jonathan said softly. But we can't do that by running away. We have to face this together. Sophia nodded, her tears spilling over. But together. As the attacks continued, Jonathan began to turn the tide. He called another press conference, this time with Sophia by his side. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras flashing as they waited for him to speak. Over the past few weeks, my family's history has been dragged into the spotlight, Jonathan began, his voice steady. Mistakes were made and I won't deny that. But I refuse to let the actions of the past define the future. He turned to Sophia, his gaze unwavering. Sophia Montrose is not my family's enemy. She is a reminder of the consequences of those mistakes and a testament to resilience and forgiveness. Together, we're committed to moving forward and building something better. The room erupted into questions, but Jonathan remained calm, answering each one with poise. By the end of the conference, the narrative had begun to shift. Instead of focusing on scandal, the media started to highlight Jonathan's accountability and his efforts to make amends. Victoria and Hayes, however, weren't ready to give up. Furious at Jonathan's ability to turn the situation around, they decided to take a more aggressive approach. We need something bigger, Victoria said, her voice sharp. Something that will destroy him completely. Hayes nodded, his expression cold. I think I have just the thing. The plan they devised was bold and dangerous. It involved fabricating evidence of financial misconduct within Jonathan's company, planting documents that would implicate him in illegal activities. If successful, it would not only ruin his reputation but also put his entire empire at risk. Unaware of the impending threat, Jonathan and Sophia found themselves growing closer than ever. Their late-night conversations turned into quiet moments of connection, and Jonathan began to open up about parts of himself he had never shared with anyone. My father always told me that emotions were a weakness, he said one evening as they sat on the estate's terrace, the stars twinkling above them. He said that caring too much would only lead to failure. Sophia reached for his hand, her touch grounding. He was wrong. Caring is what makes you strong. Jonathan smiled, his heart swelling at her words. You've changed the way I see the world, Sophia. And the way I see myself. Sophia felt her cheeks flush, her own feelings threatening to overwhelm her. You've changed me too, Jonathan. You've shown me that there's still good in this world. As they sat together under the stars, the challenges they faced seemed distant, their connection a beacon of hope in the midst of chaos. But the peace wouldn't last. The next morning, Jonathan received a call from Gregor, his voice laced with urgency. Jonathan, we have a problem, Gregor said. The auditors found discrepancies in our financial records. And they're pointing directly to you. Jonathan's stomach dropped. What kind of discrepancies? Enough to raise red flags, Gregor said. And the timing, it's too perfect to be a coincidence. I think someone's trying to set you up. Jonathan clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He knew exactly who was behind this, Victoria and Hayes. They had crossed a line, and he wasn't about to let them win. Get the legal team on this, Jonathan said. I want every detail combed through. We're going to prove this is a setup. As he hung up, he turned to Sophia, who had overheard the conversation. What's happening? She asked, her voice filled with worry. They're trying to frame me, Jonathan said, his determination burning bright. But they underestimated me. Sophia placed a hand on his arm, her eyes filled with resolve. Whatever you need, I'm here. Jonathan looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. I know. And that makes all the difference,